Chosen one, have you ever questioned why your journey has felt like an endless struggle even before you could speak or comprehend what was unfolding? Why you've constantly felt an unseen force pushing against you? It's not by chance you're seeing this right now. This message has arrived precisely at the appointed moment, before your very first breath, before your soul stepped into this realm. The enemy recognized your sacred assignment. You weren't attacked because you were fragile. You were hunted because you hold a divine purpose, one that shatters darkness and awakens souls. The spiritual conflict surrounding you began before birth, because your very being is a divine interruption. Today, you'll come to see why your path has felt so heavy, why forces tried to extinguish your calling, and why heaven intervened. If this stirs something deep within you, comment 77 below. Make sure to subscribe, hit the bell icon, and share this word with another chosen soul. It's time for vision, it's time for truth, and above all, it's time for you to rise. Number 1, before your first breath, the spiritual scouting. From the moment the plan for you was read in the heavens, both light and darkness scoped your emergence. They tried to intervene before breath even filled your lungs, because they understood, whether consciously or in the deep spiritual sensors of the unseen, that your existence would be a strategic disruption. Isaiah 49 verse 1 says, "Listen to me, you islands. Hear this, you distant nations. Before I was born, the Lord called me." That calling wasn't waiting on earthly timing. It was pre-birth declaration. You carried a banner in the unseen that made the opposition aware early, and they reacted not because you were weak, but because you mattered. In Genesis 25 verse 23, the tension between destinies in the womb shows the spiritual complexity of what was being carried inside you. Even before you arrived, your life represented a breach in darkness, a pivot in lineage, a movement in the system that could not be ignored. They leaned into your timeline with attack, thinking they could stop the flow, but every effort to touch your assignment wrote exposure into their own script. Their interference was recorded. Spiritual scouts, both hostile and aligned, saw the weight of your emergence, and what looked like early pressure was actually divine testing and protective positioning. You were surrounded, not to be lost, but to be made visible in a world that didn't understand your blueprint. Comment seeing if you felt the echo of that early targeting, as proof you were always meant to rise. The next section will peel back what those early trials did, not to break you, but to forge you in a way that gives your authority depth. The dream came again, not as a fanciful escape, but as a corridor opening inside your own knowing, a vision of a scroll unrolled before time, and your name written in light while shadows in the background tried to cross it out. That image wasn't random. It was a soft confirmation of what's been pulsing on the surface. That before you ever drew breath, the heavens marked you, and the darker currents felt a tremor of your intended arrival. There's an internal question that has sat in the silence of your life, the one that whispers, why did they move against me so early? Why was I never quite understood? Why did the pressure begin before I even had a voice? What you sensed all along, that invisible weight and the strange resistance that preceded your choices, is beginning to sharpen into a pattern you can name. You were scouted, not by accident, but because your existence carried weight that would disrupt the status quo. The opposition that felt premature, the hidden interference, the internal unrest, they weren't signs of random bad breaks. They were the early ripples of strategic spiritual engagement. You're not here because something broke. You're here because something was being read, assessed, and anticipated. That's the threshold where awareness first opens. There was a long season where you felt like a misfit inside your own story. You watched others move through life with a rhythm that felt scripted, while you moved with a hidden cadence no one else could hear. That sensitivity, why certain words landed in your bones, why the energy of a room made you retreat or stand still, why you felt both seen in dreams and unseen in society, created a loneliness that the world labeled as overthinking, being too much, or even spiritual malfunction. You carry confusion about why doors close just before opportunity, why betrayal often arrived from the places you trusted, and why the narrative around you rarely matched the inner conviction that something significant lived beneath your surface. There was a longing for meaning that didn't fit into common explanations, a sense that your life had layers being peeled in slow motion by forces unseen. Those early signals of being targeted, watched, or subtly redirected felt like punishment, yet they contain a resonance of purpose you couldn't name. That inner friction between being isolated and carrying a deeper sense of destiny was your first internal compass, pushing you toward truth even while the outer world tried to define you as broken or irrelevant. You weren't malfunctioning, you were marked. When the fog begins lifting, the pattern reveals itself. These weren't accidental wounds or random misunderstandings, but part of an unseen architecture being built around and through you. The spiritual scouting, the early targeting, the interference before identity could fully form. These were not attempts to destroy you, but to position you. The system around your emergence held a blueprint, and what looked like disruption was actually calibration. Scripture frames such deeper preparation in ways that help you reframe your story. Isaiah 49 verse 1 is not just a poetic line. It's a foundational truth. You were called before birth, declared in the unseen, and your identity was announced to the nations before the world even had the words to name you. Genesis 25 verse 23 shows that conflict and destiny were already present in the womb. Two lines, two potentials, and your life was one of the cracks in darkness facade. Those early struggles, family tension, spiritual confusion, the sense that your very presence stirred something unseen, aligned now as part of the scaffolding, not the collapse. The pressure you endured was confirmation that someone was watching closely enough to try to intervene, but the same architecture preserved the declaration made over you. This reframing shifts you from victim of circumstance to participant in a sacred design. Then the subtle signs that once felt random begin to bleed into clarity. Deja vu stops being a glitch and becomes a waypoint. Dreams that used to fade into morning now carry repeated symbols and phrases that sync with real-world catalysts. Brief flashes of knowing, the sudden rise in your chest when a decision aligns, the way small coincidences stack like messages from a hidden author. These are the quiet confirmations of spiritual scouting turning into active unveiling. Your body starts to respond differently to environments. The places that used to drain you now feel like filters, and the moments when you pull back on something without explaining why become proof of a deeper radar at work. Synchronicities shift from pleasant surprises into coded markers of alignment with something cosmic, and people who once seemed random become conduits for clues of your unfolding. The earlier internal tension, which you mistook for insecurity, is now becoming an internal GPS recalibrating to the true north that was set before you were born. These signs don't demand you prove them to others. They quietly solidify your internal trust. The veil is thinning, and the world you thought was static is beginning to reveal its layered response to the frequency arising inside you. The quiet voice you've sometimes doubted, calling you away from certain people, pausing before speaking, pulling you towards silence instead of spectacle wasn't fantasy. It was early jurisdiction asserting itself. That instinct that told you to wait, to observe, to not react to manipulation, was the original inner compass aligning with what had been recorded about you in the heavens. There's a growing peace that isn't loud or celebratory. It's the kind of reassurance that settles like soft light after years of defensive shadows. You're starting to see that your intuition was right about the small things, and now the bigger things are falling into place because you're no longer second-guessing that voice. The safety you feared would never come as present in the knowledge that the currents under your life aren't chaos, but protection, and that the early disruption was the clearing needed to prevent premature exposure to systems that would have twisted your assignment. This internal alignment isn't a sudden transformation. It's the gentle unfolding of truth, the feeling of being grounded in something more stable than the shifting opinions of others. You begin to trust the echo from within over the noise from without, And a spiritual safety field forms not because the world has changed, but because your orientation to it has. As the clarity deepens, the realization settles in. You're not becoming someone new. What felt like a fragmented identity has always been whole beneath layers of interpretation. And the moment of remembering isn't invention, it's recovery. There is a temple in your spirit that was placed before you ever had language for it. And what's emerging now is less about adding and more about peeling back. The archetypal memory of purpose, assignment, lineage, and covenant is restoring itself from buried places. The version of you that was softened, masked, or rebranded to fit survival is being peeled away to reveal the original design, the one written not in cultural expectation, but an eternal decree. This is a recovery of what was hidden, the secret identity that survived early targeting because it was insulated by divine intention, and now it rises with quiet confidence. It's the part of you that knows you were chosen, not by happenstance, but by pre-birth declaration, and that memory aligns your steps without needing external validation. Your soul's original frequency is coming back online, and the echo of it is the source of your inner authority. Now the tide shifts from internal recognition to the beginning of movement. The sensitivity you once wished away becomes a radar guiding where you step. The hunger that felt like lack is now the engine of alignment, pushing you toward deliberate action without impulsivity. You begin to treat the knowingness not as an anomaly to dismiss, but as a tool to wield, slowing when things feel off, speaking when the clarity is sharp, withdrawing when the field isn't aligned. That first activation isn't loud. It's a subtle recalibration of how you show up. You no longer chase the affirmation that used to validate your rise. Instead, you step into the small obedience of what feels right, and those steps compound into momentum. You begin to embody the truth that your early targeting didn't derail your destiny. It tuned it. The choice to honor your inner navigation becomes the first strategic move in reclaiming what was always yours. This activation is quiet, intentional, and rooted in remembrance rather than performance. This moment wasn't a random intersection. Your arrival to this message, your resonance with the layers being peeled back, is evidence that something expected you and knows you're ready. There is reassurance in the fact that the spiritual surveillance that once made you feel exposed now confirms alignment. You were not mistaken, abandoned, or invisible by accident. You were concealed, watched over, and prepped. Comments seen at the awakening landed like a confirmation, and add a reflection about the first time you felt the shift from confusion to recognition. Share a dream, a memory, a clear internal pivot. That sharing does more than build a comment thread. It anchors the ripple for others who are standing at their own threshold. The next section will go deeper into what those early pressures did for you. It will show how the heavy childhood, the rejection, the spiritual sharpening was not damage but forging, and how the tools placed in your hands now begin to feel less like scars and more like authority. And if you feel called to go even deeper, there's a sacred space reserved for our community. A private room where you receive full prophetic messages daily. Join our private membership through the link in the description and walk this path with us. Special thanks to current members. Your alignment and support keep these revelations sharp and anchored in real transformation. Number 2, the heavy childhood as divine forging. There's a difference between damage and refining, and what you experienced early on was a ladder wearing the skin of hardship. So you would not mistake the shaping for random cruelty. The early rejection, the confusion that followed you, the identity strips, the isolation, they were crucibles placed around you so that the noise of the world could never easily drown out the frequency you were meant to carry. Job's cry and his context in Job 10 verses 8 to 12 reflect the same craftsmanship. The pains you endure were not arbitrary bruises, but pressure points in the divine workshop, where what looked like erasure was actually an engraving of destiny. What they believed would silence, you became the echo chamber from which your voice would later reverberate with authority. Those childhood heavinesses weren't signs of broken design. They were the fire that purified the core, sharpened your perception, and stripped away inherited confusion, so you could carry clarity that others could not manufacture. While the world labeled your sensitivity as flaw and your silence as failure, heaven was qualifying you, teaching endurance without dulling purpose, deepening discernment without creating cynicism, and building spiritual armor by letting your sovereignty emerge from pressure rather than performance. You were being prepared not to survive quietly, but to activate visibly. Comment Forge if you felt the early pain's purpose surface into strength, and keep watching. Next we expose how every attempt to undo you became the evidence that you were being preserved, not erased. The first time you sensed the difference between what was happening to you and what others were going through, it came like a bruise that didn't match the story you were told. There was a quiet heaviness in your childhood that everyone labeled too sensitive, overreacting, or dramatic. But inside you knew something deeper was being shaped. That discomfort wasn't random pain. It was the first audible hammer blow in the workshop of your destiny. Imagine standing in the fire that refines gold, not to destroy it, but to remove the dross and bring out weight and purity. Each rejection, each moment of being misunderstood, each time your gifts were minimized or misread, was not a strike to break you, but a pressure point activating the underlying structure of who you were meant to become. You moved through homes, schools, friendships, and systems that didn't have the vocabulary for what you carried. The world's labels felt like wounds because you were being calibrated in a frequency that required more depth than surface validation. That early friction was not a curse. It was the beginning of a forge setting the temperature just right to reveal the core strength in you. There were seasons where you questioned your value because the environment around you kept demanding that you shrink or perform in ways that drained you. You were taught that silence meant failure, that vulnerability was weakness, that saying less would keep you safe, even when your inner life was full of knowing and purpose. Those internal contradictions built a pressure that felt like confusion. Why did you feel so much, yet when you spoke your truth it was ignored? Why did you see the cracks in systems others trusted, only to be labeled resistant? That was the training ground. The emotional weight of being told your perception was off, while your inner compass kept pointing to something real, created an internal tension that would later become the muscle of discernment. You lived under inherited narratives and subtle rules that would have softened a lesser spirit. But your ability to hold tension without losing clarity is the residue of that refining. The depth of your sensitivity became the mechanism through which you learned to hear truth even when the world preferred silence. And that sensitivity, once a survival tactic, is now a tool of authority. When the narrative shifts and you begin to see the pattern, you realize those early wounds were not accidental breaks, but intentional breaks that open space for reclaiming identity. The hidden architecture behind your experiences starts to appear. The family stories that never spoke the full truth, the unspoken expectations that shaped your behavior, the ancestors' unresolved struggles that echoed into your own, all acting like layers of sediment that hid the pure spring beneath. Scripture gives language to that process. Job suffering, mentioned in Job 10 verses 8 to 12, wasn't senseless misery. It was a form of divine craftsmanship, a refining so precise that his restoration announced authority. Likewise, the isolations you felt were an abandonment. They were seasons of being taken out of common flow, so your frequency could align with what was written over you before you were born. That hidden battle was sacred. Your identity was being stripped of what wasn't yours, so the original imprint could surface. The painful edits were necessary removals, and now the clarity emerging is a revealed design behind what once felt like brokenness. Looking back, the things that once felt like sabotages, doors closing at the wrong time, betrayals from trusted people, sudden shifts in safety, were shaping the pathway to rise by forcing you to depend on the unseen tether rather than public approval. These patterns are not punishments. They are corrections toward authenticity. The crushing loneliness that taught you to listen inward instead of outward created a resilience that now allows you to stand when others would fold under pressure. Those recurring setbacks trained you to differentiate between noise and sign, between the temporary voice of circumstance and the constant whisper of purpose. The environments that drained you were refining the boundaries you now carry without apology. The people who tried to fit you into boxes inadvertently taught you how to break them. That revelation, when it lands, is like turning on a light in a darkened room. The things you once internalized as defeat become the coordinates of your rootedness and unshakable authority. Then the resistance becomes less abstract and more tangible. You begin to feel the pattern of energetic interference. The strain fatigue when you step into what's aligned, the fog that descends just before a breakthrough, the inexplicable delays that come from environments acting like filters rather than open roads. It's not always overt attack. Sometimes it shows up as a heaviness in the air, a tightness around your voice, a silence that carries weight, as if unseen watchers adjust when you move closer to your truth. That distortion isn't random. Your rising frequency disturbs old systems, and what appears as sabotage is actually their reaction to your emergence. Doors that once opened easily now stay closed until you recalibrate. Conversations get twisted. Trust is tested, not to prove your failure, but to sharpen your discernment of who and what can travel with you. The pressure reveals itself in the slowing down of what used to be comfortable patterns, and while it can feel like interference, it is also the field realigning to accommodate a new version of you that refuses to regress. The way you responded to it was survival writing itself into a new language. Some part of you learned to quiet down, to minimize, to adapt in order to avoid the blowback from systems that felt unsafe. You became a chameleon in toxic territories, or you rebelled quietly, letting internal frustration simmer because open confrontation would cost too much. Maybe you people pleased about temporary peace, or maybe you withdrew entirely, masking the burning inside with a calm exterior. None of those reactions were failures. They were strategies developed in real time by the deeper part of you that knew something had a hold even while the world pressed. The fear of standing out, of being called too sensitive again, made you second-guess the voice that had been guiding you. Those defensive moves kept your core safe long enough for the refining fire to complete its work. They also delayed the recognition that the resistance was not a stop sign, but a confirmation point. Seeing those coping mechanisms without shame is a reflection that allows you to separate conditioned defense from inherited destiny. And from there you begin to reclaim what was dulled by survival into what was always meant to shine. Now the narrative flips. What they interpreted as your weakness, your isolation, your strange trajectory becomes the evidence of what they feared. The resistance that pressed down on you didn't mean you were wrong. It meant you were rising. Every closed gate, every misalignment, every attempt to mute your frequency created pressure that sharpened the edge of your voice, solidified your internal law, and clarified your path. Reclamation starts here, not by seeking external validation, but by naming what was always inside and standing in it unapologetically. The language changes. Instead of wondering why you're targeted, you start saying, "They targeted me because I carry something that disrupts their order." The voice that was hushed by comparison now declares identity. The silence that was misread as absence now holds weight. This is prophetic restoration. You're not taking back what never belonged to someone else. You're recovering what was given in covenant, what was sealed in heaven, and what was sharpened to the very resistance meant to derail you. You were opposed because you are powerful. The more they tried to block, distort, and suppress you, the clearer your purpose became, not in spite of the pressure, but through it. The systems that reacted to your emergence exposed the value of your frequency. Their sabotage made your rise legible to yourself. Comment Forge if you felt the early pain's purpose surface into strength, and add a personal reflection about a time when resistance clarified your path instead of confusing it. The next phase will open, the one where their attempts to erase you no longer bounce off harmlessly, but become the mechanism by which your unshakable identity is broadcast, drawing others into alignment and activating the broader field of remembrance. And to every soul who supported with a super thanks, thank you. You are keeping this light alive for others who haven't found it yet. If you feel called to help this mission reach more chosen ones, tap the super thanks button below. Your energy supports these messages and helps them travel further. Your voice matters, and your light is felt here. Number 3, erased but not gone. Enemies failed attempts to wipe out your calling. They built scripts to cancel you. They tried to murmur your name in darkness, reshape your destiny through manipulation, and craft narratives that would cause you to doubt your worth, all while thinking they were steering you into collapse. What they didn't account for is that every scheme became its own confession, and the divine courtroom began to register their actions as testimony against them. Psalm 7 verses 14 to 16 outlines the truth of their plotting. The very devices they set to destroy you turned back upon their own heads. Their violence returned in the shape of internal unrest, identity collapse, and shattered illusions of control. Their curses, their experienced witchcraft, their attempt at spiritual erasure didn't land as intended. They ricocheted. Proverbs 26 verse 27 says the one who digs a pit will fall into it, and he who rolls a stone, it will come back on him. That's the mechanism you watch unfold. What was aimed at your timeline loops back, destabilizing their energy, breaking their flow, and exposing them without you needing to retaliate. Your quiet became the weight of judgment. Your restraint became evidence that the system was clearing and reversing what they tried to impose. Amos 3 verse 7 lands you as a key. The stirring in your blood, the clarity rising from the ashes of their sabotage, is not random unrest. It's revelation. God does nothing without signaling it to his servants, and their failed attempts to erase you are now part of the seam that stitches your authority tighter. Comment evidence if you've seen their collapse mirror their attempts on you, and share reflection, a dream, a moment, a recognition that confirmed their undoing was operating while you stayed aligned. The next section will take that reversal and show how it doesn't just protect. You begin to ascend, turning survival into activation, and the hidden throne steps into visible rule. It began as a whisper in the quiet places of your life. Things that didn't add up, sudden reversals that looked like sabotage, the sense that someone had written you off and yet nothing truly stuck. That whisper grew into a raw, clarifying awareness. What they tried to erase actually stayed. The first internal shift wasn't strength. It was a question. Why does their collapse look like my survival? And why does the pressure they brought backfire on them while I keep rising? That question cracked open a veil. Suddenly the patterns of forced silence, emotional manipulation, and spiritual interference weren't just random cruelty. They were the outlines of a courtroom drama you had been caught in without knowing it. Their dark strategies. Instead of ending your thread, bounced off the protective architecture around your calling. What once felt like defeat now began to hum with something else, validation. You weren't being worn down. Their constructions were unwinding in your presence. The initial realization that their intended destruction had become the way to their own undoing was the first small revelation that what was happening to you was operating under a higher law, and that law had already turned their violence into testimony. The emotional terrain of witnessing their unraveling, while still holding peace, was complex. There was confusion in watching the people who try to define your future through curses, rumors, or spiritual attacks unravel in ways that weren't obvious to others. An unease that maybe you were supposed to retaliate, to expose, to justify. But there was also a deep, almost sacred recognition that their collapse was not your doing, and the part of you that had once internalized guilt for surviving began to breathe. That inner pressure you carried, feeling too sensitive, too aware, too connected, was reframed not as an affliction, but as a spiritual jurisdiction that allowed you to watch the unravel without being sucked back into their chaos. The voices that said you needed to fight fire with fire faded in the face of the quieter, heavier truth. Your stillness was not an action, it was adjudication. Seeing their mental fragmentation, relationship breakdowns, paranoia, and loss of direction while you maintained clarity didn't numb you to empathy. It confirmed that the attempt to overwrite your identity had instead scribed their own indictment. Their pieces fell apart in ways that mirrored their own methods. The secrecy exposed itself, manipulation spiraled into isolation, and schemes intended to bind you manifested as self-sabotaging feedback loops in their lives. When you step back, the deeper structure emerges. These weren't just petty attacks or personal vendettas. There was a systemic push against what was encoded in you. The enemy's efforts looked like fragmentation, but underneath the surface they were trying to intercept a flow that had heavenly permission. In ancient scripture, the idea the accuser brings charges, and the divine response doesn't always come in immediate defense. It comes in exposure. Zechariah 5 verses 3 to 4 describes a flying scroll carrying a curse, marking theft and falsehood, and ultimately driving out the unclean. There's a witness to what was unlawfully attempted, and that witness doesn't disappear. The spiritual legal language your oppressors employed to try and silence you, whether through words, rituals, or emotional conditioning, registered in the same system as their own guilt. The energy they invested in casting you out or rewriting your narrative turned into very evidence of their overreach. That hidden battle zone, the one that used to feel like personal sabotage, reveals now that what they built against you had built its own collapse into its foundation. Their pattern to try and control your timeline was caught and mirrored back, not to glorify their failure, but to let you see that the web they spun had a design of self-destruction embedded by spiritual law. The clues were everywhere once you knew where to look. Moments when their accusations intensified right before their own systems crumbled, when they sharpened their stories about you as a way to hide their own internal disarray, when their attempts to gaslight or rewrite your history were exposed by the very people they were using to validate those narratives. These aren't coincidences. The divine reversal has signatures. The hypocritical momentum of their voices collapsing into silence, the sudden unmasking of their intentions through small cracks in their own lives, the way their influence faded without your aggression, simply because the authority behind you was authentic and the counterfeit behind them exhausted itself. Their energy bent back on itself like a boomerang, true to Galatians 6 verse 7. Do not be deceived. God isn't mocked. For what one sows, that will he also reap. Their spiritual investments in manipulation and fear didn't translate into control over you. They seeded their own destabilization. Watching this unfold is a revelation not just of their failure, but a larger order correcting itself. Your field remained intact because it was sealed by purpose. Theirs did not because they tried to hijack what wasn't theirs to claim. As the internal awareness deepened, reconciliation with your own story began. You stopped seeing your silence as weakness and instead read it as the quiet legal processing of spiritual jurisdiction. While they flailed trying to expose you, you held the inner space that allowed the truth to surface without theatrics. That was never random resilience. There was a reorientation happening inside you, a recalibration of identity from survival mode into recognition of embedded authority. The stirring in your blood, the moments of inexplicable calm in the chaos surrounding them, the way clarity returned after the noise subsided. These weren't gaps in your perception. They were confirmations from a higher source that the system was doing what it was designed to do, reverse the attack and restore the rightful narrative. Amos 3 verse 7 lands like a seal here. The Lord doesn't operate in hidden chaos. He reveals his plans to the ones carrying his truth. What you felt rising inside, the increasing ability to see their undoings and not take ownership of them, is not chance or trauma coping. It is a continuation of revelation. Spiritual restoration is knitting back what the enemy attempted to erase, using their own exposure as a thread. The transformation begins when the lens flips fully, from watching their collapse to seeing your rise in relation to it. Their failed attempts to wipe out your calling become the contrast that sharpens your mission, the dark negative that defines a developing image more clearly. Their narratives intended to drown out your voice now form a background that your clarity presses against, making your evidence glow in ways it never could if you had never been opposed. You begin to speak with a voice that doesn't need to justify. The calm in your presence becomes the loudest testimony. Reclamation is not about fighting their stories. It's about occupying the space they tried to steal with the truth that was always yours. That internal shift is fierce. Instead of reacting to their doubt, you declare identity. Instead of defending yourself from their attempts, you deliver value that renders the accusation irrelevant. The knowing that their opposition confirmed your mark becomes armor, and the very pressure intended to break you now propels you forward. The reversal isn't passive. It's an active statement that what was used to attempt to erase you has become the platform from which your authority is broadcast. You are not isolated in the undoing. Even their closest allies, those who once echoed the lies they fed into your environment, begin shifting as your light refuses to be dimmed. There's a ripple effect. When their constructed narratives fall apart, the people who carry them begin to feel relief and confusion simultaneously. Those ripples don't just expose the attacker. They awaken others in your circle to their own alignment, because they see your stability amidst the collapse and realize there's a different rule operating on you. That rule isn't visibility granted by popular agreement. It's visibility claimed by covenantal truth. You begin to sense that your rise is not solitary but catalytic, that their failure didn't isolate you. It localized your influence, pulling others into their own reconciliation with what was always true about them. This is when the energy fully turns. Reclamation spills outward, the field recalibrates, and the evidence in your life becomes an invitation for others to step into their own unassailable identity. You were opposed because you are powerful. Their attempt to erase you were not proof for your insignificance. They were markers of threat, spiritual defensive maneuvers against what your calling would dismantle in old systems. The more they tried, the more the spiritual order clarified your placement. Their collapse, measured not by drama but by the quiet ways their inner structures decay, is a testimony that the higher system is correcting itself through you. Comment evidence if you've seen their undoing mirror their assault and felt the clarity settle. Share the moment when you realized their attack didn't derail you. It highlighted your authority. The next phase opens now. The reversal will shift from internal confirmation to outward activation, and what began as protection will become dominion. Number 4, from survival to activation, the prophetic shift. There comes a moment when the survival story stops being a background theme and becomes a launching pad for your prophetic arrival. The internal stirrings you once questioned, the sudden clarity, the subtle pull toward new rhythm, the atmosphere responding to you, are not delayed destiny. They are the activation sequence. The veil lifts just enough to reveal that what kept you alive under siege was not a passive miracle, but active preservation positioned for propulsion. You are no longer walking the effects of what happened to you. You are moving in the power of what was prepared in you. That shift is the difference between existing under correction and operating an assignment. The weight that used to drag became gravity that now centers others. The battlefield that once felt survival-oriented now looks like a runway. Every near miss, every target attempt on your life, every buried blow calibrated the momentum necessary for liftoff. Your presence begins to signal more than endurance. It signals rulership. The divine timing behind your activation doesn't wait for permission from broken systems. It commands alignment and draws those around you into the same frequency. Comment activation if you felt the internal movement turn from endurance to authority, and add a personal reflection about the shift when survival story became assignment stepped into public velocity. This is the hinge. What was private endurance becomes public dominion. And the next phase will reveal how your rise begins to pull others into their own restoration, making your visible activation spark for collective unsealing. There is a point sharp and undeniable where the question shifts from, why did I survive that, to what am I now commissioned to do with what survived? That moment is the crossing of the threshold. It is not a slow dawning anymore. It is a decision. Passivity is no longer tolerated by the inner voice that has been gathering strength while you wait in the wings. You stand now between the life that kept you alive by default and the life that your preservation was always meant to launch. The survival story, which once insulated you, becomes a foundation beneath your feet. The split-second internal mirror you face isn't asking you who hurt you or what took you down. It's asking, will you take the activation that was built into your endurance and step fully? The almost seasons, the close calls, the repeated reset points were not detours but runway clearance. The weight that once felt like dragging chains has become the gravitational pull that centers others. This choice point, when you stop letting survival define your identity and begin to let it propel your assignment, is sacred, and it demands a clear yes. Will you trade the safety of reactive survival for the responsibility of sovereign activation? Everything you once gave away in confusion, time, energy, silence, identity to make it through, comes back to you now as reclaimed authority. That season of being in reaction, of adapting to survive in hostile or misaligned environments, was not waste. It was training, the kind of refinement that builds voice without arrogance and presence without pretense. Now the language shifts. You speak not to be heard by broken systems that try to label you, but to govern what has already been entrusted. The internal ledger is balanced. The apologies you rehearsed under pressure are replaced by declarations made with intention. You don't ask permission to move into your calling, you call it out. The rituals of reclamation are simple and fierce. Naming what was taken, drawing back the energy you scattered and compromised, and standing in the space where the throne was always meant to be. The season of giving away your power becomes a season of calling it back, like a king retrieving a crown that was hidden in plain sight. This reclaiming is not soft. It is deliberate, prophetic, and binding. You are not merely recovering pieces of yourself. You are summoning the original mandate that was deferred while you endured. Now begin to name what lives in you. The sensitivity that others call weakness is a form of spiritual radar. You feel shifts in tone, unseen currents, and misalignments before they fully manifest. The discernment that made you question popular narratives is a code-reading ability. You see underlying structures and motives because your spirit has been tuned to a frequency that detects dissonance. The memory that surfaces without explanation isn't confusion. It's ancestral and covenantal recall, the archive whispering what was written before your time. Your endurance became a fire that didn't consume you but forged keys. Keys to doors that were locked to others, codes to systems of influence, scrolls of identity previously sealed. You carry torchlight where others walk in dimness. This is not theoretical language. You've lived the calibration. That quiet hunger in your bones is not lack. It's fuel for what's been preparing to move. The odd parts of you, your quiet strength, your intuition, the parts that felt isolated, are your armor, your declaration, and your access. Recognize them as tools, not anomalies. The path ahead is not some hidden road you have to discover. It is already under your feet, revealing itself through each aligned step you take. Activation doesn't wait for perfect conditions. It unfolds as you move, and what once looked like uncertain direction now becomes a series of pivot points that confirm you're in rhythm with the assignment. The map wasn't lost, it was latent, and your movement turns a fog into signposts. Every small obedience becomes a revelation, and the clarity you seek is produced by motion, not more waiting. The ancient promise that the vision is for an appointed time, Habakkuk 2 verse 3, is now being fulfilled not in the future, but in your present steps. The delay wasn't denial. It was preparation to walk with weight. What seemed like isolated incidents of survival now string together into a coherent progression. Your life is cinematic not because of chance, but because each frame is part of a divine storyboard, and you're the one stepping into each scene with authority. Keep walking. The next acre of ground opens beneath the certainty of your movement. When the view widens, you see you were never meant to do this alone. There's a rising order forming around the frequency you carry. other sealed ones, other voices unshackled from old narratives, other presence bearers who begin to resonate with the same activation. The collective alignment is not coincidence. It is tectonic. Soul tribes, divine clusters, and unseen alliances begin to surface as the ripple from your activation touches theirs. The propulsion of your life stops being a personal rescue story and becomes a reference point. Others recognize the shift in you without needing the explanation because the testimony of your walk authenticates the move for them. The rising order refuses to shrink to fit collapsing systems. Your visible embodiment gives permission and pull to the ones still hesitating in the backgrounds of their own purpose. The energy that once isolated you now attracts the right convergence. People, opportunities, and spiritual check-ins that accelerate the shared trajectory. The awakening expands beyond you. Your public activation becomes a hinge for communal unsealing, and the rising order carries the truth that strength is contagious when it's rooted in divine alignment. This is your moment to take command of the energy you move with, not through ego, but through stewardship. The authority you're stepping into comes with lines that must be held, boundaries that protect the frequency, choices that reflect vocation rather than impulse, and devotion that sustains alignment rather than performance. What was once scattered by survival tactics returns as focused intention. Think of it as a consecration. Each decision now is a declaration. Each boundary a sacred wall that preserves what lives inside. The command isn't loud. It's ceremonial. You do not give your attention like currency to everything that asks for it. You govern your internal field like a temple keeper guarding the flame, aware that how you allocate energy rewrites the architecture around you. There's a trust placed in you not because you earned it by striving harder, but because the one who placed saw the refinement in the fire and knew you would steward a legacy. This is where discipline meets destiny. You keep your rhythm not out of fear of losing ground, but out of fidelity to the assignment that has been activated in you. Everything you've been through, the pain, the delay, the near breakings, the quiet perseverance, has led to the singular truth: you are ready. That phrase isn't soft encouragement. It's prophetic declaration. The survival that shaped you is not the end game. You carry scars are now logos. Histories are now mandates. The internal unrest that once made you question your timing now dissolves because the evidence of readiness is in your calibrated presence. No more waiting for external validation. No more trying to justify the rise to those who doubted the process. The portal before you is open. Step through it with intention. Your authority is not a hope. It's a confirmation. You have been rehearsed in the hidden, tested in the margins, and prepared in the fire. There is no more room for hesitation. This is your final charge. Move out of surviving into owning. Your rise doesn't need loud announcements. It's felt. It commands alignment by virtue of its clarity. This is not a conclusion. This is a summons. Common activation if you felt the internal movement shift from endurance to authority, and add a reflection about the moment the survival story turned into visible assignment. A dream, a memory, a sign that confirmed you weren't just surviving. You were being propelled. Your testimony anchors others still on their thresholds, turning private remembrance into shared unlocking. The next phase builds on this ascent. The way your activated throne begins to pull hidden ones into the field, amplifying their own unsealing and turning individual dominion into generational inheritance. There's a silent current running underneath everything you've been through and everything now emerging. This was never about mere survival. The forces that tried to extinguish you were the instruments by which your rise was given dimension and accountability. Their attacks became the evidence that you were significant enough to target. Their attempts at erasure rewired into the mechanisms that now broadcast your authority, and the weight of your story became the scaffold under your throne. What was forged in hidden pressure now carries public impact. Divine timing threaded their sabotage into the exact paths you needed to walk, so that your activation could not be mistaken for accident, but recognized as destiny with weight. You don't chase validation because the field already confirms you. Peace follows the confrontation. Lineage breeds easier, and the subtle recognition from others who don't need explanation comes as acknowledgement of a living reversal. Revelation has collided with action, and the imprint of what's coming is already visible in your cadence. Your movement is the blueprint made manifest. Heaven saw it first, and now the world is adjusting around the authority that was always written in you. It began as a whisper in the deep places, a vision that arrived not as a healing balm, but as a quiet confirmation that everything you endured was not random damage. It was the raw material of elevation. In the dark hours when the world looked like it failed you, there was a current beneath the surface tugging at your attention, asking you to hold because something more was being formed. That current was an accident. It was a divine underflow pulling your survival story into a larger narrative. The trials, the betrayals, the silent betrayals disguised as normal life. They were not meant to break you and leave you fractured. They were meant to sharpen the edges of a throne. In that interior space, you began to sense a shift. The very things designed to hide your assignment became the scaffolding that gives your rise weight, that makes your authority traceable and undeniable. What was meant to bury you became a foundation of what now stands unshakable. A contrast reveals purpose. Those who tried to extinguish you threw everything they had to keep you small, thinking pressure would flatten your horizon. Instead, their attacks became evidence, markers in the spiritual ledger that you were carrying something worth contending with. The more they aimed to erase your story, the louder that story echoed in the field. Their schemes and manipulations didn't disappear into nothing. They rewired into a narrative that broadcast your authority, without you having to explain it. The accusations, the darkness, the attempted rewrites became the background that highlights your clarity. There is a sacred irony in the way opposition carved out the exact contours of the space you now occupy. Their intention to derail, you supplied the raw contrast needed to reveal how aligned you always were. What you thought was collapse was calibration. What you thought was exposure became the evidence that the divine kept you visible for a purpose, not destruction. In the silence after conflict, you began to feel something settle. Not a return to the old normal, but rightness that comes when timing and truth synchronize. Divine timing worked through what looked like sabotage. It threaded the disruptions into the necessary sequence, so that when you stepped forward, your movement would not be mistaken for luck or reaction, but seen as destiny with weight. Those apparent detours weren't delays. They were strategic pauses that allowed your preparation to outpace the noise. The enemy's missteps, the surprises, the painful why me seasons all became calculated pressure points that ensured your activation would carry a resonance beyond personal triumph. You don't have to justify your rise. The pattern, the cadence, the timing itself testifies. There is a coherence now in your story because what was applied against you has been repurposed into the vector that carries you ahead, and what was once a fragmentation of experience is now a divinely woven trajectory. You don't search for external validation anymore because the field around you confirms your elevation. That peace you feel after the fight, the lack of frantic proving, the quiet confidence in spaces where once you felt insecure, it came because the system realigned in your favor. Generational weight eases. The people behind and around you breathe differently when your movement shifts the atmosphere. Some of them don't need to know the details of your path to recognize the activation. They sense in the way things respond, in the way doors that were stuck now open, in how silent permission begins to ripple. Your authority is no longer a story you tell. It is a reality that lands on others like gravity. The evidence of the reversal is not just internal. It's relational and atmospheric. Those who were held hostage by old narratives begin to feel the release because your rise recalibrates what's acceptable in your line, and their inheritance expands with you. There is sacred purpose in your cadence. Every step you take now carries blueprint signatures. Movement reveals more of the design. You aren't stumbling into destiny. You are walking with it under your feet, and each footfall makes the path ahead clearer. The world around you adjusts not because you demand it with noise, but because the authority embedded in your motion shifts the gravitational field of possibility. The activation isn't a one-time flash. It's a rising waveform. Your smallest alignments compound, your quiet obediences accumulate, and your presence becomes the reference that draws others into their own remembering. What felt like survival was a rehearsal. Now your operation is a performance. People begin to arrive at the right time. Conversations pivot with less effort. Synchronicities become signposts, and the inner knowing that used a flicker becomes a steady beacon. Your movement is a living instruction manual for those still waiting for permission to rise. A shared frequency begins to form. This is an isolated ascension. It's the beginning of collective activation. The ones who resonated with your pain, who once mirrored the same silence, now find voice because your authority gives them permission to remember theirs. Soul tribes are not constructed. They are magnetized. Divine clusters align as the ripple of your rise touches those who carry connected codes. The legacy that tried to hide itself behind isolation now unfolds in communal resonance, and what was once defensive solitude becomes a platform for rising alliance. The energy you put out calibrates others. Your alignment writes new identity language into the field for those who were taught to dim. The proof of the broader purpose is in the way a single shift in you softens a hardened family system, heals a recurring pattern, or unlocks clarity in someone who saw your rise before they believed in their own. You are being entrusted now, not for consumption, not for endless performance, but for stewardship. Your energy is a territory, and what you activate in yourself reverberates beyond you. Boundaries become sacred lines of protection. Choices become declarations of alignment, and devotion becomes a rhythm that keeps the frequency true. This is a ceremony. The way you guard your focus, the way you choose what to respond to, the way you invest attention with intention, these are the acts that sustain the elevation you're walking in. The activation carries responsibility. It's not about accumulating influence for ego, but about maintaining flow so that the rising order around you continues to unseal. The call is clear. Tend what has been returned, calibrate what has been reclaimed, and keep the internal narrative aligned with the outer movement. You don't burn too fast or hide too long. You govern. Everything converges here. The survival, the hidden pressure, the reversal, the activation, the rising order, the stewardship. You are not preserved for safety alone, but for sovereignty. That's the final truth that lands like gravity. The story was never only about making it through. It was about becoming the force that turns what was intended to limit into the signature of your dominion. The world is already adjusting around what heaven saw first. Now your assignment steps into visible effect. Comment reversal if you feel the quiet power in your walk shifting others, and add a reflection, a dream, a memory, or an inner knowing that confirmed this wasn't coincidence but commissioning. The next phase is coming. Your visible dominion will begin to awaken hidden thrones, pulling others into their own rise, turning personal activation into collective legacy. You were seen, sealed, and preserved. This isn't a soft whisper of comfort. It's a sovereign declaration that what was meant to end you became the threshold of your activation. Subscribe if you haven't yet, like this video, and comment, "I am chosen," to let this message anchor in your soul. This message may not stay online forever. Download your copy and transcript in the vault. Ideal for journaling, inner rituals, and sacred study. The link is in the description below. Share it with another chosen one who needs confirmation. What followed you, tried to take you out before birth and failed, is now the proof of your unbreakable assignment. Thank you to all supporting members. Your commitment fuels the light and keeps the unsealing alive. 4 full prophetic revelations daily. Join the membership via the link in the description. Your spiritual path deserves more than fragments. Step into the full light. And if this message moved you deeply, Consider tapping the Super Thanks button to support the mission. Every Super Thanks helps hold the frequency and spread the reversal further. Rise in what was written and stay tuned. What's next will show how your visible dominion becomes a platform for others' remembrance and expansion of lineage legacy.